Hello, welcome to Financial Insider Weekly. I'm your host, Michael Gray, CPA. My guest today is Richard Lambie. Richard is a professional fiduciary, and he's one of the people that sort of helped to put this industry together in California, one of the founders of the Professional Fiduciaries Association of California. And so they help to create standards for professional fiduciaries here and so forth. I've known Richard for a number of years. Previously, he was a trustee at Bank of the West. And as you'll discover from his accent, he's English, but a delightful person. So, Richard, thanks so much for joining us again today at Financial Insider.
You're welcome. Happy to be here.
Great. Okay. So today, Richard and I are going to be talking about selecting and compensating a professional fiduciary. And actually, we're going to be talking about some side issues as well, about family fiduciaries, friend fiduciaries, that sort of thing. Bear in mind that, again, I'm a California CPA, and Richard is a California fiduciary, and although the basic idea of fiduciary is the same throughout the country, we're going to have various things that are going to apply that may be a little different from state to state. And especially one of the things I think we're going to try to touch on today a little bit is some new rules that have come into effect for fiduciaries in California related to compensation. And those may be influential eventually across the country, but right now they're going to be rules that California fiduciaries are going to have to deal with and that their clients need to be aware of. So again, let's just sort of get into some of this stuff. All right, well, first of all, what is a fiduciary? Maybe let's just sort of start there, because people say, well, as people talk about fiduciary, what the heck are they talking about? So what is a fiduciary?
Right, if we can start off a little bit with that, Mike. Appreciate the introduction. And so what we're talking about with a fiduciary, and I'm going to limit most of my comments today to what a trustee does.
Okay.
Because so many people who have any level of assets, as I know you've had other speakers on this program, particularly the attorneys, will talk about doing an estate plan, putting together your living trust, and naming a trustee under a living trust. So I'm going to have a lot of my comments related to what a trustee is, and I think the word trustee rolls off the tongue a little bit more easily than fiduciary. And I think as we get towards the end, we can branch out into how the rules and the roles of a court-appointed conservator, or as in different parts of the company would be a guardian, would apply, because that's much more restrictive. And really, in California, the work that I've done over the last 30 years, almost 90% of wills and trusts and any sort of estate plan, even if people die without a will or a trust, is handled by a family member. So really, to put things into perspective, we're talking about maybe 10% of the population that would have a non-family member trustee, and then within that, maybe 5% or so that may look outside of the family member or the traditional bank trust company to having a professional fiduciary fill that role. So, so a private trustee, to get into that a little bit, is somebody who's named under the document to act as a trustee, and a trustee is a manager. If you think about a company, when a company is set up, it has to have a manager or a chief executive officer. So the trustee takes that role. And when you get into that role, and very often it starts out with mom and dad. So mom and dad are their own trustees, and they put their home in it, their bank account, their investment account in it, and everything's going along just fine. But at some point, and especially in the document, they're going to name a backup, a successor trustee. So if they're sick or if they passed away, then we're talking about who's going to take it on next. So that's really where we're focusing on, is the successor trustee, or as you started out referring to us as a fiduciary. So the successor fiduciary in that role to manage all of the affairs of the trust. And of course, the primary purpose of any trust will quite often be to support mom and dad. Because mom and dad, or the individual who's established the assets, the trust has to take care of them first. So that's always what we're focusing on, is so long as that person is still breathing, then the purpose of the trust is to take care of them, and the fiduciary, the trustee, that's their job, is to follow the terms of the trust and take care of their primary beneficiary, and everybody else who comes in later on is of a secondary interest. So hopefully that gives us a little bit of an idea of where we're going.
Right. So as far as the places, again, that fiduciaries are, as Richard said, principally trustees these days because of the popularity of living trusts, then conservators in a little different capacity under court supervision, and then also executors under a will would also be fiduciaries, but his primary work is as a trustee. Okay, so maybe you can sort of explain how it is that we choose family members, when family members are a good choice as a trustee, and maybe when you should think about a professional fiduciary as an alternative.
Right, and as I was explaining, the 90% of the cases the family members will step in. Now, the issue is, should they step in?
Yeah.
And because quite often, you as a CPA, and I know the attorneys that I deal with very frequently, have all sorts of nightmare situations when family members think they know what they're doing. But the classic situation where a family member trustee would be absolutely appropriate, do a fabulous job, minimize the expense to the trust and everything else, is particularly where the family member would be a professional of almost any description. And over the years, I found that people who are engineers, particularly as we're based here in Silicon Valley, are amazing people. They will research everything. They will tie down details that other people won't even think of. So if they're a professional, got a professional mentality, absolutely can do an excellent job if they have the time.
Yeah.
And we run into, probably as you do in your practice, people who have all sorts of expertise but absolutely no time. They're traveling, they're fully involved in their own profession, and just can't deal with it. The other situation that would be a good fit is when the assets are relatively limited and local. So in the Silicon Valley area, there may be a family residence and bank accounts, brokerage account, and so anybody with any degree of professionalism could certainly step in and do that, and also particularly when the family members live in the immediate area. I've just got through dealing with a relatively small trust where all of the personal property was left to out-of-town relatives. And the gentleman died in May, and here we are in August, and it's taken us 3 months to get the beneficiaries to come into town, identify the assets, and deal with the clean out of the house. And of course, in the meantime, we've got the expenses of running the house. So, there's a little bit of a slip up there, but we are able to control that process quite well. And the family members are extremely appreciative of the fact that they have a local independent trustee dealing with handling the sale of the real estate, providing professionals to deal with the clearance of the house. But as I say, there are situations where the family member can do a good job and has good rapport with the other family members. So most of the time it does work out pretty well.
Now, you and I dealt with a situation a while ago, and so I just want to sort of share the story a little bit for people to try to get their thoughts around when will a professional fiduciary fit in. So we had a situation, I had a situation that I had a husband and wife, a senior couple, and Dad I could tell that his health was failing. And so I talked with him a little bit to sort of plant the idea or suggest maybe he should think about whether a professional fiduciary might be helpful for them. And then he sort of put aside the idea for the time being, and then, though he had a health issue, basically had an episode of hypertension, had to go to the hospital. And so then basically I sat down with Mom and I believe it was one or two of the daughters at the time, and we sort of got everybody on the telephone, and I said, okay, now who can step in to help Mom out here? She's dealing with a tough situation. Things need to be managed. And basically everybody said, we're so busy in our lives, we just don't really have the time to do this. And I said, well, just recognize that there are alternatives. It's good to know, but somebody has to help mom out. And so we were able to work out an interim situation, because Dad did get better for a while, where Richard was able to work as like a co-trustee with Mom and Dad, sort of as a preview process, which can be helpful in some circumstances. And he was able to sort of manage the affairs while they were also sort of looking. They still retained power over their assets. And so it sort of gave a warm-up period for the family, which was great. And then when Dad eventually passed away, then we had family meetings and so forth, and everybody accepted the idea of Richard continuing. And today, though, we do still have one of the children as a co-trustee, which I know isn't one of Richard's favorite arrangements. But anyway, it sort of worked out. Would you like to comment on that a little bit? But anyway, this ended up, I think, in general, working very well for this family, that as a continuation of management of their property, and Mom has been very well cared for.
Yes, and that particular situation, going back to my earlier comments, really fits in the mold of how an independent trustee would work. And in the case that you're talking about there, Mike, the closest child lives 200 miles away.
Yes.
And so we have that as really a qualifier for the need for an independent trustee to step in, or in this case a co-trustee. And then added to the complexity of the assets, as you know, there was a closely held corporation which added to the interest of the case in terms of what happened with the annual tax returns, dividend payments coming out of the company, eventually the sale of the company. So the assets were relatively complex, the family members were distant, and really what's happened in that case, I was trying to sort of draw a little bit of a picture in my mind with regard to this, and what it's akin to is really a very much larger family estate. Maybe some of the wealthy individuals in the country would have their own family office. Well, this family isn't really big enough to have their own family office, but they have an independent trustee, so all of the major bills for for Mom who's surviving come into the family office, all of the bills are paid, accounts are reconciled. There is a fairly sophisticated gifting program going on with Mike's help doing the gift tax returns. So we really have, on a small scale, a fairly sophisticated arrangement. And as you've suggested, Mike, the children don't have to worry about where the finances are, what's happening with that. We monitor all the accounts. We can transfer funds very flexibly. And I believe it's really worked out very well. The 4 children are very comfortable with the arrangement. They get regular reports. They have access to information when they need it. And Mom's pretty comfortable that she still has some level of independence. So, yeah, it's really worked out very well in that case.
Okay. So we've introduced this topic. I think we need to sort of charge through. We've got a lot of stuff still to talk about. When an attorney or family member is considering a profession of fiduciary, what should they consider in the selection process regarding the background and experience of that fiduciary?
Yeah, so here we're assuming that the family has moved on, and either with the advice of an attorney or the family members are out there on their own. And when they're looking at the fiduciary, it's a little bit hiring somebody. I was just going through this with my own residents to get some new windows put in.
Yes.
And you don't just plop a pin into the yellow pages and go for it. You asked for information. So when you get the information, you have a contractor lined up. You ask them what their experience is. Have they done this before, or is this their first job? So you really want to find out what their experience is. Do they have a background? And as we talked about with the example of the one client, they had particular levels of expertise. We had a closely held corporation. We had enough interest to do gifting programs and estate tax returns, gift tax returns. So does the fiduciary have some background and experience in the areas that are relevant for that family? Maybe very simple and straightforward. The biggest issue, and I believe over the years I got a little bit of a jaded view with regard to the financial affairs, very often it's the social skills, the social welfare skills of the trustee, if they're taking care of the elder, if there are illnesses, their caregivers needed, do they have some social work, if you want to call it that, mentality that they could bring to the case to really add in? Are there extensive real estate holdings? Do they have rental properties that need to be managed. So they've really got to quiz the fiduciary. And also, go through licensing, because the fiduciaries are now licensed. When did they get their license? What were their previous careers? Do they have the staffing? Do they have a professional office that can handle those things? And also, again, sort of double checking, as my example with the contractor was, do they have references that they can provide, other people that they've done work for? It's just a little bit of an issue with the privacy, because you don't want to go telling all the family stories and all your other clients, but you should be able to sound out some of the other professionals, maybe attorneys in the area, about what the skill set is, what the experience is, and generally do your own research. So it's very much a buyer beware format that the families should follow when they're getting into bringing somebody in, because it's an extremely wide varied role. And you're not just dealing with the bank account, you're dealing with all of the financial accounts, gathering information to give to the CPA for tax returns, just a whole issue in complexity.
Right. So when you talk about trustee, the word trust there is in there. And what it boils down to is you're entrusting this person with your family's assets. And if you have somebody that gets into this role, whether it's a family member or a professional, that abuses it, then it can be a disaster. And sometimes even, unfortunately, we had a friend that was a professional fiduciary, and this person was very trustworthy. Unfortunately, she had an assistant that it turned out not to be so trustworthy and took advantage of a situation that ended up being unhappy for everybody. So anyway, just exercise a lot of care, and it means though that the family members need to be aware still. Richard says he's providing reports to these people. You need to watch what's going on, and possibly, particularly if your family situation is significant enough, you may want to have the CPA get involved, in some cases even doing audits if things are significant enough. So anyway, do you want to make any other comments beyond what I just said? Or?
Yes, I mean, what I was talking about before was a little bit of a screening process, the buyer beware issue, and also there are things, and the attorney will advise on those, and we'll get into fees in a little bit, but with regard to the controls and the checks and balances, one of the things that I always encourage people who are kicking the tires in my office to do is to consider asking the attorney whether the trustee, whether the fiduciary should be bonded in their case. And that's something that absolutely, the family member should be asking. Bond will be paid for out of the assets of the trust that's being managed, but it will secure particularly the liquid assets against any loss or malfeasance. So that is something that can definitely be raised. The family should be questioning almost everything, and the trustee that can't provide reasonable responses should maybe not be considered for the position. So the family should be pretty brutal about that and do things for their own satisfaction.
Right. All right. We'll just have about 10 minutes left, so things are going quickly, Richard, just to let you know. Let's talk a little bit, though, about this issue of compensation, particularly, or maybe we could talk about the contrast for a bank trust company compared to a professional fiduciary, how they operate, maybe a little bit of a contrasting compensation or how people work. Can you give a little background in that area?
Yes, and I'm always a little bit nervous about talking about fees independently of the services that are provided.
Right.
And very often the banks and indeed the brokerage firms will provide tremendous services. They do an incredible job on the wealth management side, and they'll deal with significant assets, and they've got tremendous people to take care of that. And they will almost exclusively be compensated on a percentage of assets. So the family that's coming in knows exactly where they stand, so much in the way of assets, so much in the way of compensation. So that'll be very, very clear. The banks will generally, although there's some exceptions, the banks will generally not take on what I would call messy family situations. And what I mean by messy is if there's litigation, if there are assets that are somehow complex, and what I mean by that is percentage ownership in assets or different types of limited liability corporations, family partnerships, the banks sometimes struggle with taking those on because they're just not clean enough. When the professional fiduciary comes in, their role isn't limited by a board of directors, by checks and controls and balances, and they can do much more, as I was referring to earlier, in terms of social work, in terms of the hand-holding, balancing mom and dad's checkbook, making sure funds are transferred on a very limited and local level, as well as taking care of the big picture. So the comparison would be that the banks will generally be charging on a percentage of assets, whereas the professional fiduciary, while some of them may charge a percentage of assets, will generally be on an hourly fee rate. So the more complex and the more time that's involved, then the larger the fees would be for that.
Okay. Do you think that it's an advantage to have family members as trustees, or the idea that maybe they will either charge a reduced fee or waive the fee?
Yes, well, that's a very clearly loaded question there, Mike. Thank you.
Yeah, okay, well, you gave it to me.
Yeah, the limited or loaded part of that is that you're talking exclusively about compensation.
Yes.
And the family member, and probably you're aware in your industry of people who will do very low-cost tax returns.
Yes.
And you take your shoebox in, and within, miraculously, 17 minutes, they've got the tax returns done and the refunds coming electronically somewhere, probably onto a Visa card. And so, this is exactly the same type of thing, that you can get a limited local service that may not address all of the issues. So, yes, the family member can get involved and they can do some sort of job, but, there are so many pitfalls in terms of being a trustee. And particularly the family member trustee, if it's a son or a daughter and there are other children in the family, they have to be absolutely crystal clear that they're dealing with the trust administration as a trustee, not as a son or a daughter. And very often that role gets confused. So yes, the fees are little or nothing, but the family strife, the family conflict can be quite significant. So.
Right. So, yeah, so exercise a lot of care here. You need to be aware there are fiduciary duties. This is something that you really, if you elect to take the role as a trustee, that you need to get guidance from an attorney. We would always recommend that you work with an attorney in that process. And it ain't easy. And I have whole programs. In fact, I'll be having some interviews coming up with Bob Timmerman here shortly. There'll be new programs, but we have past ones where he talks about the role of being a trustee and should you elect to take that. So we just have a few minutes left here, so there are some important points that we want to cover and I need to move on. All right. So maybe I'm just going to sort of throw this up. Why don't you highlight to us what are some changes that have happened in the area of compensation for trustees and so forth in California? And maybe this relates more to the area of court-supervised type of trusts and conservatorships. And so maybe you can explain a little bit about what's happened. And
yeah, do we have another hour to go through that?
Yeah, just try to. Yeah, I'm afraid you're going to have to hit a few highlights, and maybe you can contrast it a little bit with how it otherwise works.
So what I'd like to do is to review the trust issues, because I say that's the bulk of what people will come across with the family living trust. So you're looking at 3 different locations for how a trustee is compensated. One is in the trust document, and I got trust documents here that say reasonable compensation. Which is pretty wide-ranging, but that's what a professional fiduciary and usually a bank trust company will look for, is reasonable compensation. That's in the document. And then if the document's silent, the probate code, the California probate code, will provide some guidelines as to how a person can get paid as a trustee. And the interpretation is actually very interesting. If it's not in the document, and the probate code may provide too little guidance, there are these things called the California Rules of Court. And as they relate to trusts, and there's a similar provision very close by, 7.776 provides very specific guidelines on how a trustee gets paid. So if anybody's out there and they want to dig into that a little bit, California Rule of Court 7.776 is absolutely a goldmine of how the guidelines should work. What we're talking about, particularly in Santa Clara County, there was a case that came along and caused some changes in local rules, and in fact there's a pending legislation change as it relates to conservatorships. Conservatorships, by their very nature, have an elderly person or a disabled person who's at risk, and the court is very, very protective. The court investigator, the probate judge is very protective of the individual. So there are special rules that pertain to conservatorships, starting out with the fact that the conservator cannot get paid unless there's an order of the court. So there are all sorts of disclosure requirements. The fee schedule for the fiduciary has to be filed by the court. Monthly invoices have to be filed with the court and also sent out to family members and all interested parties. So it's really a change in terms of full disclosure, setting the expectations of what the fiduciary's fee schedule is, and then managing those expectations by fee invoices being produced on a regular basis. So there should be absolutely nothing hidden in terms of fiduciary fees, and certainly coming up in California with the new rules, it'll be fully laid out, and there will be tremendous detail on how the fiduciary is being compensated in a conservatorship.
Okay. Richard? Thanks for boiling something in an hour program into about 3 minutes, and that's about how much time that we had. So we are really just about out of time here. So I guess first I want to thank you for being with me here today. One thing I guess I do want to mention is one thing that people don't give much thought to is this area of compensation, that they just say reasonable compensation. They may not even have much language related to that in their will or trust. And when you're going to have a family member that's going to be filling that role, just bear in mind this is a big job that you're asking this person to do. They deserve to be compensated, and so you should think about it. And also because this is an area, the seed of family arguments about how people are going to be compensated. And so it's something to really talk with your attorney about, talk with your family members about, and to make clear, to spell out. So folks, we're out of time. Hope we've given you some things to think about. We'll see you next time on Financial Insider Weekly.